Socialism has never worked.
Don't you just love it when left-wing ideologues, incensed about the fact that no one is buying into their shitty debunked ideas, have to resort to trying to revise basic historical facts? Whether it's Venezuela magically no longer being socialist after a decade and a half of left-wing intellectuals such as Noam Chomsky pointing to it as an example of socialism being a viable economic model, and the fact that the majority of their economy is directly nationalized and controlled by the government, and the parts of the economy that aren't nationalized and controlled by the government are controlled by government-established communal councils where workers directly control how businesses are managed. This seems to be the preferred method of damage control for the ideological left, and thanks to the internet, it's all coming to an end for them. Because the only reason their propaganda could be so prominent for the longest time is because they controlled all the outlets for where people could get their information. However, now information via the internet has been decentralized in a very similar manner to how blockchain is going to decentralize the economy. Now controlling the narrative is nearly impossible. So let's listen to how AIDS Uyghur here tries to explain to us why trying to create wealth by dividing wealth and expecting that to lead to economic prosperity isn't completely fucking retarded.
It's become a truism repeated by right-wingers and people who just don't know much about political theory.
Oh, so it's gonna be one of those now, is it? You say socialism doesn't work? Well, you're just a dumb right-winger. Stop spreading your Fox News propagandas, you stupid rube. He says that we don't know anything about political theory, and then he pans over to Bernie Sanders as an example of a socialist. Oh, man. Well, first of all, there's the obvious problem that you can't use rhetoric and ideas of how you think something should be, or as you described it, political theory, as a metric to observe human action. Also, what about the economic calculation problem? You know, without a price ratio, how can producers determine how to properly allocate their resources? Or the incentive problem. Without a profit incentive, how can you even have a functioning economy? Yes, some people can do with a gift-based exchange or mutual aid, but just like with bartering, most people are not satisfied with trading commodities for a payment which they don't desire in return. Socialism has not, cannot, and will not ever be a viable means of basing your society's economy because of these basic economic problems which socialists either baselessly reject or are willfully ignorant of. That isn't rhetoric, that's a fact, unless of course you can refute these economic problems. Not even talking about the commodity price going way the fuck up because of government monopolization and lack of incentive, or the ethics of forcing people into labor just for the socialist economy. Simply explain how you can have a socialist society which is capable of sustaining itself, where large portions of the population don't starve to death or meet some other grisly fate due to a lack of available resources, or where the government or other organization which centrally plans distribution doesn't collapse into itself due to the fact it can't manage its own resources. That doesn't mean cherry-pick some random data, like you love to do, and don't explain yourself. I want you to give me an explanation from an economic standpoint of how socialism is a viable model, then provide data or historical evidence which accommodates your claim, and by viable, I mean it simply works well enough to sustain the bare minimum of what an economy needs before society begins to break down and famines start to occur.
Defined by a textbook, socialism is the collective ownership of a society's means of production. Means of production could be non-human resources used to produce things of economic value like real estate or farmland, natural resources, equipment, buildings, infrastructure, roads, and collective ownership of these things meaning workers or the public own them.
which fundamentally has two problems, the first of which being that it's impossible to define which properties are collectively owned in a socialist society because a property's use is defined subjectively. In other words, what can be used as personal property for you can be used as a means of making profit for me. A house is a popular example of personal property in a socialist society by socialists. Well, what if I were to rent out my attic? Then I'm using my house to obtain profit, which according to socialism would make my house a means of production. There is no point at which private and personal property deviate away from one another, and therefore the state in a socialist society would ultimately have to have control over everything, since they would have to strictly control how people use their property in order to even attempt to enforce this rule. And secondly, if something isn't private property, then it can't be property, because what defines a commodity as property is having ownership over it. In order to have ownership, you must have absolute dominion over it and be able to control how you associate with it. If you can't exercise dominion over your own property, then you don't own it, which means it isn't property. Now, this doesn't mean that people can't voluntarily practice communism with their property, that people can't let others use their property, or that people can't even live communally. Only that there's no such thing as common ownership, and that everything that deviates away from private ownership must necessarily be theft, since the government can only obtain property through the forceful appropriation of private resources.
Some define socialism as a system by which social equality can be achieved. In this broader way of thinking about it, socialism could mean any kind of socialistic philosophies or attitudes or tendencies, or a system that combines orthodox socialist practices with other constructs like capitalism. For instance, you could say that some Scandinavian countries are socialistic by modern standards, not because they have a system where the government or workers own everything, but because they have a system where there's a relatively greater amount of intervention by democratic government to protect socialistic ideals like egalitarianism, civil rights, equal education, environmentalism, and the prevention of abuse by actors in the free market.
Well, which one is it? Is the market regulated by the state, or is it a free market? Are you not even thinking about the words coming out of your mouth right now? Because you just contradicted yourself within one whole sentence.
Socialism is an extremely broad umbrella term to describe a wide range of political, social, and economic systems, movements, and ideas.
Anarchism is not a socialist philosophy. It can be, but anarchism is merely the rejection of all political authority or unjustified hierarchy, in favor of voluntary cooperation.
Let's explore where socialism comes from, some of its variations, and how they functioned in society. Some elements of socialism have ancient roots. Ancient Buddhism taught that the individual and all other living beings are interconnected and interdependent, and that all humans should be treated equally and with kindness.
Which is a metaphysical principle and not an economic philosophy.
People often draw parallels between socialism and Buddhism, and many say that Plato's Republic first articulated the notion of a socialist state, a state that aims to solve social problems by government action through higher taxes and redistribution of resources.
Plato's Republic is not a real society. It's a Socratic dialogue written by Plato to describe what an ideal society would be like according to him. And it's pretty obvious that you've never actually read Plato's Republic, because Plato clearly outlines that his ideal society would have 3 state-enforced classes of people: producers, auxiliaries, and guardians, and that people assigned to these positions must perform that position and only that position. And in Book 4, Plato clearly outlines that his ideal society would have a market economy. Not just any market economy, but one where money is used by everyone to fulfill their own base desires specifically.
There are lots of other aspects of Plato's Republic that don't at all align with modern socialism. Socialistic ideals are seen being portrayed in the Hebrew Bible, which in many places says that people should be treated equally and that we should be generous to the have-nots. The book of Leviticus says you shall not oppress or exploit your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. Deuteronomy says God enacts justice for orphans and widows, and he loves immigrants, giving them food and clothing. That means you must also love immigrants because you were immigrants. Don't take advantage of poor or needy workers, whether they are fellow Israelites or immigrants who live in your land or your cities. From Ecclesiastes, it is God's gift to humankind that everyone should eat and drink. From Psalms, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Now, this might get awkward for anti-socialist Christian conservatives, but the New Testament is also chock full of socialist themes.
You know, it's funny how you say that socialism is specifically collective ownership of the means of production. Then you go on to point to all these vague references to charity and sharing in religious texts or philosophy as examples of socialism. You're using the definition of socialism you're trying to correct people for using, while trying to explain to them that socialism is something different entirely. Talk about a confused message. But to be fair, arguments which come from cognitive dissonance tend to be broken and tangled in logical errors more often than not. So while this is bad argumentation, it's not a level of terrible that's completely unheard of.
The term socialism itself wasn't used until the early 19th century in Western Europe by philosophers and social critics like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Henri de Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen. At first, the word was used not to describe any one political system, but as an abstraction, a philosophy that societies could or should operate to serve the collective, as opposed to just thinking about the individual. This was in the wake of the French Revolution, and in large part a reaction to the poverty and inequality that was growing out of the Industrial Revolution.
You have that entirely backwards. The Industrial Revolution was innovating and creating competition which got people out of poverty. People who point to the Industrial Revolution as a grim point in our history are either being overly anachronistic in comparing modern working conditions with those of the 19th century, which is flawed because of innovation and technological advancements which have made production cheaper, less wasteful, and have improved working conditions. They also never seem to question the reason why people were leaving the countryside in favor of urban areas. That's because back then you had the choice between back-breaking labor on a farm or back-breaking but slightly safer labor in a factory. There is a reason that since the Industrial Revolution, the world population has skyrocketed and the average lifespan has more than doubled.
The means of production will then be controlled by a proletarian state, which in theory will lead to an egalitarian, stateless society that governs itself without coercive institutions.
Yep, hyper-totalitarian statism will lead to the state just sort of going away, according to Marx. Marxists really are that fucking delusional.
Really important point here. This is not what the Soviet Union or its, quote, communist successors achieved or were working toward, despite their pretenses. Bolshevism, Maoism, and the like are inherently right-wing, totalitarian perversions of Marxism.
So, now not only are the actual real-world examples not true socialism, but they are right-wing perversions of socialism. Somehow individualist, huh? I don't know. That one was actually so insanely stupid that I realized that the rest of the video, he doesn't even attempt to debunk the argument his video claims to, so I guess I'm done.